Welcome to Varn blog, and today I'm going to start off with a provocational statement. The crisis of the left wing and or liberal mind is the same as the crisis of the Christian one. It is that affectation hides a lack of thinking. No matter how much theory you dress that affectation up in, no matter how complex the thought world is, what one gets is gust of popular sentiment. So, as was once said of the Christian mind by the Protestant theologian Mark A. Noll, well, actually the evangelical mind, is that the crisis of the Christian mind is that there isn't one. And it's similar to the crisis of the left-wing mind. And this doesn't matter how much we pretend to be, anti-moralist, anti-identity politics, anti this, that, or the other. How much we critique is not even against that. After all, what are we critiquing? What emotional and social need, what material need is being met by that critique? Now, I obviously love critique. I love tearing down bullshit leftism. I love it. But what's the need there? What does it surface? Is it all that I do? If I have a meeting with activists, and I'm sitting down with them and we're breaking bread together, and we're having a sharing session, am I going to turn on all my critiques of every dumb thing activists do? Many leftists I know have done this and then wondered why people think they're splitters. I don't do that. Sometimes people think that because what I do on the podcast or on these blogs or whatever, what I used to write about is critiquing people's bad ideas, that's primarily what I think the work of leftism is. There is a sense that I do approach my Marxist analysis from the standpoint of negation, that you find the pathological weak points and ideas and you break them open. You find those fissures and you rip them open. But in a very real sense, that's not directly relevant to what I do on a day-to-day basis. I'm in a union. I teach kids. I show up with my partner to do immigration activism stuff. I have a normal life. The left-wing scene, the left-wing milieu, to me, is actually an active distraction for why I would be a leftist. The fact that I have to know who has relationships with whom in New York or Berkeley because this pundit, had some secret fight and affair with this other pundit who both had magazine articles in this other place. I hate the fact that I have to know that. No amount of theory will make that relevant to most people's lives. And I get that kind of nonsense, that cultural, clustered, downwardly mobile intellectua that are fighting for scraps in an area that is socially very wealthy, has many social resources that they don't even realize they have, does lead to things like the PMC thesis being popular, and academics and professionals always talking about the professional class and this, that, or the other. I realize that. I get that. I also know who they are. I hate to tell a lot of people this. The biggest predictor of someone's politics is their region, their age, and whether or not they were raised religious, regardless of what the religion was. Although different religions have slightly different rates and different predictability variables, right? But there's something to be said about what social goods and how they affect people's ability to deal and think. Doug Lane and I recently on a podcast that unfortunately, if you're not a Zero Book subscriber, you haven't heard. But you can subscribe if you want to hear it. But I'll recount a little bit of it. Got into a fight, and one of the things not a real fight, I guess, it was more of a letting off of steam. But one of the things that we discussed was Lane's contempt for activists. And he says, well, joining a club doesn't make me respect you any. And I was implying that, well, neither does sitting in an armchair and running and talking to the void and making money off of a left wing news channel. Like that impressed me either. That if one threshold for being impressed by someone's engagement and another threshold by being impressed with someone's engagement is that low level of self-identification, of gust of popular sentiment, that didn't mean much to me. And I tried to tell him that the way he, the media lens, when you become a media leftist, all right, and I keep on bringing up this Pat Buchanan line, movements start as movements, and if they can't gain power, they mature in the businesses, and if they still can't gain power, they die as grifts. I think we see that over and over and over again in the cycle of left-wing worlds. That's why we generate sectarians and cults and ways for people in very small parties to make money without having a job, or to make an additional bit outside of their academic job, or to have social power outside of their relatively minor station in academia, etc., and so forth. Pat Buchanan would know, right? I mean, he did that on the right, and that is the right that I come out of, by the way. This is why some of these socially conservative turns and this methodological nationalism that I see in a lot of social democracy across the board, I may add, is something that I viscerally respond to, because it actually, to me, mimics the most dishonest elements of conservatism and usually goes in that direction. When you deal with hurt people struggling through their collapsing world, sometimes those people don't become good leftists. In fact, a lot of the time they don't. They turn to God, right? Religion is the opium of the masses, and that's going to come with it all kinds of baggage. And when that doesn't work anymore, they're going to turn to entertainment, depoliticization, and hedonism. Now, woe unto me to be too besmirching upon hedonism. But there is a certain point where a total lack of self-discipline instantiated in you, regardless of the fact that it is what we might call optimally rational for your social situation. If you're an impoverished person enjoying something when you have the second to do so, because you might not have it again, it's actually situationally rational. It's bad for you. It is deleterious to your person and condition, but it is situationally rational. That desperation often breeds social conservatism, not in reaction to others, but in reaction to yourself. There's other things that breed social conservatism, though, and that is a want for power when you can't get it. And I think we see how this goes in light of what I've been calling on my podcast with other listeners, the burnout. Doug Lane and I used to opine about how the death of anarchism well, often you don't have to even give the old opium up, right? Like, have you seen what the opioid epidemic has done to the church-ridden parts of the world? They come hand in hand. And I say that because it, in some ways, is a feedback loop that deals with social conservatism. And what people who go into this really desperately want is a sense of community. Arguably, the thing that leftists supposedly, well, yeah, well, not so much opium, so much as, opioids, but yes. Vicodin and and your various pain relievers are a little bit easier to get. So you go into this world with this idea. You come in with this idea, and I was listening to two New York leftists talk about a play about Catholic conservatism in Wyoming. Now, Flannery O'Connor gets thrown around. For those who don't know a lot about my background, I talk about how I grew up pretty much working class. My mother was a waitress who became a nurse when she was 40, and the opioid epidemic hit my family directly, and it led to her not being a nurse for more than 10 years. And I'll leave it at that. My brother, I'm not going to mention which of my brothers, but it's not hard and he doesn't share my last name, so in some ways I'm being fair to him. But my brother had many runs in and out with addiction and alcoholism and the various cheap drugs you can get. Worked in the informal sector of the economy. He has for 10 years. Makes a pretty good raw income. Doesn't have health care. Had an accident and had to medicate for it and went down a downward spiral that ended up with half his jaw blown off and then being reconstructed and him still owing hundreds of thousands of dollars to have that fixed. I'm being deliberately vague on details because if I give you too many details, you can look up who he is. But that's my youngest brother. And it was what led me into a lot of things I've done. Where I lived growing up I lived in this town called Gray between Macon and Milledgeville. Gray is a once, even as early as the early 2000s, bustling suburban town. I worked mostly in Macon. Macon's overwhelmingly black community. It is like a little Detroit in central Georgia, particularly as the military Keynesianism in the nearby city kind of started to dry up and people started running to that money. And the prisons started to be consolidated and shut down. The first thing it shut down in Macon was the paper mill, then Brian Williamson, then YKK, until the only thing sustaining the city was a Geico office call center, which was relatively massive because of the low cost of employment there. And hey, Michael, it's weird when one of my first students is now a podcast fan and is way into his adulthood because you guys don't realize how old I actually am. So that's the world I come from. I actually was, and I do fit the trend of the working class person who did good, got educated, got out, and became a conservative. I just didn't stay there. All right. I did not stay there. Partly because I went back to my home community and there was no way out for me either. Like, so what jobs were there in the area? You could work for Geico. I did. It sucked. You could work for the prisons. I did. You could work for public schools. I did and was good at it and loved the job actually. And then I was informed that I was probably going to be laid off. And I resigned to avoid getting laid off because before the massive layoffs, if you ever lost your job as a teacher, even during a layoff, you were probably blacklisted. To be not offered a contract, regardless of the reason, usually had to be reported on your next teaching job application in that state, and that meant you were out. So I resigned and got into a PhD program to do educational research in Mercer, started doing the preliminaries of my educational research, got informed that I was not that I was going to have to take out more loans for this program. I no longer had a job, and then my soon to be ex-wife lost her job as well, and so I took the first job I could get, which happened to be from a conservative professor friend of mine who taught me Hegel. He taught me Marx and Foucault. He taught me Nietzsche. He encouraged me to, and he helped me do the application to do a brief study in Germany so that I could learn to read German. And at one time I could speak it better than I do now that I butcher it to crap. I do. Yeah, this was about, most of this was before we met, Erica. I met you at the very end of this period. So you met me when I went to Korea. So this was about that time. So my conservative professor friend said, "Hey, send me your CV," and I did. All right. He knew at this point I was a Marxist, but he was kind of hoping I'd find my Christian roots and my anti-communism in Korea. I'm not going to lie, and the opposite happened. I got more and more radical the longer I was there. And it's funny, I mean, I see Christian roots, you're like, Derick, I've never really been a Christian. I went to a Baptist church for a little while as a kid, encouraged by my parents to fit into the area that we grew up in. My family is, my family's tradition is Irish Catholic, Scotch Irish, converts to Catholicism, some Episcopalians in my stepdad's family, Jews, and then a bunch of, people who went off into various religious movements, Protestants, some became fundamentalist, some experimented, some like my biological father did all of it when, even though he had Jewish ancestry, went through that. Went through a Buddhist phase in which I became more sincerely invested in it than even he was. And then, that was an early phase of my life too, where I was a pretty religious Buddhist, and I've come back to it when I've had crises. I understand the religious mindset because I've gone through it. So someone in the chat's asking, why did you become more radical in Korea? And there's a bunch of reasons why. One was actually a response to academia. I had been trained by my working class parents who wanted me to get out. My mother was a huddle house waitress most of my childhood. Before that, she was a secretary at an air conditioning plant. Before that, she was a waitress at a small cafe in Augusta, Georgia. And during a brief time in which we were homeless together when I was very young, I think it was like 3, and we lived in a car. And she met her high school sweetheart when I was 4. And met her high school, met her high school sweetheart when I was 4. They got married. That man became my stepfather, and he was a mechanic. And so while he actually did come from a kind of upper middle class background in the early 20th century, his family had fallen on hard times. Medical debt had wiped his family out. He had done a stint as a NASCAR pit crewman in the 70s, and then re-engaged with my mom. They wanted nothing more for me and for me not to grow up in that world. All right. My mom wanted me to get out of, dirt farming life that had been part of my family's heritage on her side, going back generation after generation after generation. They'd just been that part of my family been soldiers and sharecroppers for like 100 years. No, my stepdad's a cool guy. And my stepdad treated me like I was his. A great man, actually, and I don't say that about many men. And my grandfather was also, one of my grandfathers was and I'm not going to say which one because I don't want to disparage. Like family members might watch this and think I'm disparaging them, and they're kind of right. But one of my grandfathers was an inveterate racist, and the other one was a diehard Christian anti-racist, and he come from a crypto Jewish background actually, and a Catholic background, and they had all converted to Methodism. That got brought up about my stereotypes about this. Well, my one of my grandfathers, who was an inveterate anti-racist, made sure that I spent a lot of time in the Black community, and would take me to Black churches as a child, even though I wasn't Christian, and he knew that, and he wasn't trying to put pressure on me to convert, which was also interesting. He just thought I needed to know that world, and it behooved me most of my life. I used to talk about this as I grew up, because I also got more and more in academia. My world got wider and wider. Right. This is how I kind of know, like, I am truly speaking a class reductionist. I moved up in social class. My world got wider and wider where I lived. Right. And then at a certain point, it started becoming more of color again, but of a different set of people. And that's a reality to the way class works in the United States. It is not that you can say that, like, to be Black is to be working class, because that's not true. It is fundamentally not true, but it is also fundamentally true that in certain areas, that you can't, the distance between the white middle class world that I lived in and the kind of mixed working class world that I lived in was greater and greater and greater the more educated I got. How does a right-wing academic go about teaching Marx? Well, he was actually very sympathetic to Marx. He would just tell me Marx's fundamental problem was that he replaced the good and the beautiful and the spiritual and the dialectic with the material. All right, because this guy was a one of my two professors that were conservatives. One was a Catholic, and the other was a Presbyterian. And the Presbyterian was a Hegel scholar, and a good Hegel scholar. I mean, legitimately good. He, however, had little interest in doing like academic research, and eventually, I think now he runs his own ethical consulting firm. He does philosophical ethics consulting for business. It's a weird gig. I guess it's good work if you can get it. And what you see from this, so why am I telling this story, right? I learned about Marxism from this guy who also told me to read Saul Alkalinski, because he was like, look, I was a leftist before I got the scholarship to study at the Sorbonne. All right. And he was like, I was in the Marines. I come from a working class background. I studied at Sorbonne, and it made me a conservative. But when I was a conservative, we would read Saul Alkalinski, and we would talk about what these leftists did, and we would try to outdo it with them. All right. Well, that's the difference. I'm going to read this. Ethnic minorities are just as easily incentivized by committee membership and managerial positions as anyone else. Bureaucracies are pretty egalitarian as long as their staff obeys. To a certain degree, that's true. Particularly in state level bureaucracies. Business bureaucracies are a little bit more interesting. Weirdly, though, when I say about like my movement of the bureaucratization is that you have a different set of skills that you often encounter due to who's allowed to immigrate to the United States. And it means that the ethnic diversity changes. And I hate to say this, the ethnic diversity on the left actually was roughly similar to the ethnic diversity in the upper crust of the United States, not because leftists are on the upper crust of the United States spectrum, although they do live in the cities that are, by and large, statistically speaking. I don't want to say like there's no leftists in like rural Louisiana, because it's absolutely not true. But there aren't that many. And this all came up for me today for a variety of reasons. I was thinking about my background and why my relationship to left culture is so fraught. I have people like Doug Lane who constantly insist that I am closer to most leftists than he is. And I find this weird. I find it weird because all of the people I know on the left and my partner, if she's around, she could attest to this because she uses me as a rural person whisperer. All right. Because I can code switch. I can speak academic, high academic, and leftese, and I can drop on a dime, get a little bit quieter, let my natural accent flow through a little bit, because this is closer to the way I used to talk. Now I don't talk this way anymore, and even right now, as I'm trying to affect it for you, it's very hard for me to do, and it sounds fake, but it's closer to the way I grew up talking. And I don't do that when I'm talking to working class people because they're not fucking morons. But I can switch into that mode. You know, I know that mode. For cultural reasons, maybe it's because I was religious and kind of an ethnic minority where I grew up. For reasons of like, I got sick of being shamed for being working class. No, he doesn't teach at the University of Wisconsin. Actually, he used to teach. He used to. His first position, I believe, was at Emory. Then he worked at the Georgia College and State University where I grew up. And no, I don't think he works at University of Wisconsin. Although he might. I don't know. I actually need to look it up. I think he's in North Carolina now. And so I grew up in this world. I also grew up in this intellectual milieu that was Joanna, I can't unhide my accent now. I was actually I did an interview today with Hugh and Nicole of the Let's Ride what's it? Let Us Ride. Let me get the podcast right. Run With Us, excuse me. I always screw up that podcast name. Let's Run With Us today, and we were talking about this because they did this tour of the United States and really hung out with like working class activists and whatnot. And I said, you know, even before I was abroad, and when I do this code switching thing so naturally when I was abroad that I would pick up other people's accents. Like my best friend, and so I had two really close friends in South Korea. And one was a Newfoundlander from Canada who was a sinologist and had been educated largely into Ireland and then in London. And when he would drink, his Newfie accent and his learned Irish accent would come out, partly because he'd been used to speaking Korean and Chinese so much that when, you know, he actually didn't communicate in English all that much. And I would start picking up his stuff. I still to this day call people mate from just hanging out with him. It wasn't even like it isn't an affectation. I just picked it up. I am still working on the book of Lash, and who fucking knows when it's going to be published. So I have finished half of the research for it, and I'm only writing half the book. So, you know, that's easy, right? And I have written I've written an introduction. My co-author's written a foreword, and we've redone the outline about 5 times. So just to answer that, but let me get back on the topic. I had this bred out of me as a sign of education. So particularly because I was an English academic and I have a speech impediment naturally, in addition to all this regional dialect stuff. You guys will hear it sometimes. R's, L's, and W's in my mouth all become the same sound. And after staying in Korea, it got worse. But uh so I really over enunciated, over pronounced, really tried to sound as mid-Atlantic as I possibly could, because that was the dialect of education in my area. It's dialect of media. And I also, when I talk about my educational background, I wanted to be a science writer and communicator. My initial degree set was anthropology and communications, and then I realized how dumb communications was, and so I moved into um. Oh no, I don't. I won't affect a British accent. Don't worry, or whatever weird like what is it? It's transatlantic accent that he has. I swear that's something else. Um, and I also won't dress like Mark Twain, even when I hang out in New Orleans, which is my second favorite city in America. So I try to hang out there as much as I can. No, I don't think I ever met anyone who spoke like William F. Buckley. So I lost my accent. It comes back when I'm around my family, so I can pick it back up naturally. And there are certain words, water. When I say water, that's my natural accent. Water. I don't say water or water. It's water. Um, there's a few other words that you can hear it that I can't get the southern out, and it's also a betrayal of my class because that's a specific class dialect. Um, Southern English until the end of the 20th century was very class instantiated, and you could tell if somebody was descended from planters or sharecroppers or whatever. World. Also, and ant, like ant as in the insect, aunt as in the person, and yeah, those are. And when I say them, they're the same word. Um, World. So, what's my point today? My point is, I think we have to take the causes of social conservatism and the poor community somewhat more seriously than we do. I do not think that means we have to parrot it or condescend to it or say it is correct. Um, oh, it's very classist. Like I actually went to speech therapy classes, and yeah, it was designed to make me speak in a certain way. Um, I've gone through the Midwest and noticed that, and it's because the Southern accent has become a class and cultural marker, as opposed to a actual regional marker. So yeah. So what does this have to do with paleoconservatism? Why did I end up a paleoconservative? I tell the story all the time. One is that in my own life, when I would struggle with working class problems, the people who spoke to it were not the leftists that I encountered in college. Now, the leftists I encountered in college were not Marxist leftists. Okay, I went to college in 2000 from 1999 to 2003, and then again from 2005 to 2007. And I met like a lot of post-structuralists and like people who would say they were anarchists, but they were like my first image of anarcho-liberals, right? And then I encountered International Answer in its WWP PSL days. And during the anti-war movement, and I encountered a bunch of like Seattle and Pacific Northwest anarchists when I did my one trip. I was part of zine culture in the 90s, and part of our aspirational parts of this culture was to try to participate in leftist dialogue, because what we associated with our own class was backwardsness, and in retrospect that was bullshit. All right, like my experience of middle class left world is that a lot of it is still just as culturally reactionary as anything I experienced as anything I experienced in in the working class. But you guys can argue about Chris Hedges on your own. But my trajectory from here was interesting because I found the anti-war left unserious even in the early aughts. It was not very well supported and it was very sectarian, whereas the anti-war right was more willing to talk to people and try to meet them where they were at. It was just the truth. At least where I was at. I mean, that was the thing. If you were in like the Bay Area, I'm sure some of the international answer stuff had more sway over you, even if you were a working class person. But where I was from, they didn't seem to speak to people of color either. They weren't comfortable in black neighborhoods. They wouldn't go like I talked to Pascal Robert and Jason Miles about this. They wouldn't go into black churches. There was so much that they wouldn't do, even though they spoke a good anti-racist game and they tried to connect to the struggle in Iraq. And they would sneak stuff in about like critical support for Ahmadinejad and shit like that, which just totally alienated the average person. And I just couldn't take them seriously. And so, and the people who were serious were like Catholic and libertarian, anti-war activist. They were also anti-death penalty in my area, even though they were extremely conservative. And so that's where I got in. Also, they emphasized community because of the religious background that they were in a way that I heard leftists talk about but never do. All right. And this only got worse. Even when I was coming out of paleo-conservatism, I consider myself beginning to be a leftist in 2007. When did Katrina happen? It's actually before 2007. Let's see, because this is a big turning point for me. It's 2005. See, I'm getting old and I'm running these things together. In 2005, so this was when I was beginning to give up on my paleo-conservatism. I worked an insurance job. I was beginning to deal with inner city schooling. And Katrina happened, and I got on a bunch of Jewish and Catholic friends of mine got on a bunch with a bunch of like radical leftists, went down to New Orleans and started serving water. And somebody made a big deal out of, serving donated meat. And I know this is one of these things that like you always hear people make fun of, but it really happened. And we had to kick them out of the kitchen. And while I'm all about people like inducing vegan stuff into their diet, and that's actually somewhat easier to do now because a lot of that stuff is no longer as class coded as it used to be. It was just such a fiasco, and it made me just still like, even if I was coming out of the paleo-conservative, it's like, no, these leftists aren't worth it. I don't trust Democrats. Maybe this group of people called the left libertarians would be where I needed to go. Now, left libertarianism has its leftist form, which is like basically anarcho-syndicalist and Marxist and blah 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 blah. Well, I mean, I'll get to my stance on vegetarianism, by the way. Like, I do eat meat, but I don't eat a lot of it, and I would like to be a vegetarian. And I move that way more and more every day, partly because meat's being more priced for what it actually should be. But anyway, I'm responding to you, so I need to get back on track here. And so I was coming out of that world, and I didn't trust the leftists I worked with, but I kept on noticing that the paleo-conservatives that are around, some of them would start becoming more libertarian. Others would start to be more nationalistic. And I was never anything more than a civic nationalist, right? I didn't even really believe in civic nationalism. I used to say I was anti-globalization because I thought that everybody needed to develop their own path to modernity and to be left alone to do it. Yes, Kevin Carson, exactly. Actually, I was reading Kevin Carson at the time. A lot of the people around C4SS before C4SS was a thing. I was also there's this guy called Roderick Long. He was in Auburn, and he was like this paleo libertarian, but he thought that sexism and racism and class disparity were real. So he would talk about like class, like he would call it classism, but he would talk about like bureaucratic opportunity cost to entry of the working class. And like that started getting me more and more into that direction. I ended up involved with the Mike Gravel campaign in 2008. I wrote a lot about the housing crisis before it happened. In fact, I started writing about the housing crisis in 2004, predicting it. And I became more and more Marxist in this time period because the people who were agreeing with my economic prognostices were Marxists. And I also started thinking about what I wanted in a world, and I wanted a more global world and a more local world at once. And if you think about when you talk about communism and you talk about communist societies, that's where I started to really change what I believed in more and more to a Marxist framework. Theory wasn't how I did that, though, and there's a reason why I entitled this "Limits of Theory" today. Because while I'm considered a big theory head, and I try to know my history and I try to know my theory, what actually motivated me was a mixture of material circumstances and the ideological explanations that I was given not making sense. Grimlock says a lot of people on welfare remain socially conservative. That's true. It's true in my family. It split a lot of my family down the middle. Actually, a lot of the people in the boomer generation in my family grew up dirt poor in the South, and they remain social conservatives for most of their life. My grandfather, who I told you was a diehard anti-racist, and one of my grandmothers, who was not married to this grandfather, so different family, was also a diehard anti-racist, and their politics were adamantly opposed. One of them was Catholic, the other was, Jewish or Methodist, and how much do you think ideology matters, Grimlock? Because sometimes I think that you're often right about things, but haven't thought about why they may be true. You just think that they're true is enough. Maybe there's an inclination there. You've often been right where other people around you have been wrong. But I actually think it's interesting why people end up conservative. One of the things I talked about in my Hugh and Nicole interview is we talked about, they mean anti-welfare, are very limited on who could get welfare, or they don't consider what they get welfare. One of the things I talked to Hugh and Nicole about is internal to a nation state imperialism. That a lot of the quote rich cities that pay more to the welfare into taxes, into the federal taxes or whatever, they'll often justify their positions. You see Californians do this. That they pay more into the federal government than the quote red state takers. Well, they're not looking at what the red state takers are actually getting from the federal government. Most of it goes to the military. Sometimes it goes into farm subsidies for agribusiness. And what they're taking and how they're getting so wealthy is brain drain, is finishing from that brain drain, finishing commodities extracted not just in other countries, but also internal to the United States. And that builds a whole lot of resentment. Legitimate resentment, I may add. I said on this interview today, which will come out probably in 2 or 3 weeks. Sorry, it's an audio only interview, so it wasn't live streamed here. That even I, in my heart of hearts, have an anti-New York prejudice deep in my heart. There's also a psychological reality that I think we have to come to cope with in the left, and we don't know how to deal with it. And that is stress is a psychologically conservatizing factor. I don't mean it makes people politically conservative necessarily, but study after study after study shows that leftists and liberals under stress make the same kinds of fear-based political calculus that conservatives do. Oh boy. And I think we misunderstand that when we see the way. I think there's a certain reactionary core to American leftism and liberalism that isn't ideologically reactionary, but because of the stress they feel in general society, they do the same kinds of things you see ideological reactionaries do. And and in some cases, it starts tripping into actual substantively reactionary positions. And it doesn't matter if you're an identity-driven leftist or a class-driven leftist. This happens all the time. I'm going to push back on this. Most conservatives I know have a normality of self-vicinity and following rules and wanting to be left alone. Most leftists I know have a morality of self-sufficiency, ideological individuation, personal individuation, and wanting to be left alone. They just do. Lakoff argues that this is about like the metaphors people offer. I think that's bullshit. I think it's material reaction. I don't think it's more than the American left. I think a lot of people like to pretend the American left is somehow sui generis, unique in these problems, and is absolutely not. That's actually why American leftist trends tend to dominate the European left, even while the American left somehow idolizes them. It's a weird way. The theory comes from Europe. The history attachment comes from Europe. Americans process it, put their own spin on it. It shows back up in Europe in the American way of phrasing things, and that's real. It's a real trend. I saw it when I was outside of the United States, and I see it when I'm in it. In fact, what I was fascinated with was the way like anti-American Germans had New York Times taste. Are there a way to counter these fear-based reactions? Meet material needs. This is actually a big point of why I talk about dual power and all this stuff all the time. You make people feel more secure, they're going to be less conservative, and particularly if it's in their material interest to be less conservative. Conservatism is not in most people's material interest unless they're well off and have a power base in the system as it exists. All right. I think Corey Robbins writes about this. Corey Robbins is often kind of liberal for my taste, but he's not wrong about this. That conservatism is often someone who had relative power losing that power. And the ideologically they spend to hold on the power is given. But it's also very attractive aspirationally to people in the same system who want the same power that they see their conservatives have. It's perfectly, again, it's individually rational. Some people, when people talk about false consciousness, if there's any real sense of that term, it's this, right? I talked about this in the fourth form of alienation from your other worker through competition and aspiration to be a part of some cultural group you think is better than you. Usually it's a cultural group that is within your class, but is opportunity hoarding within that class. And because the proletariat has becoming the wage relating proletariat such a huge part of the population now, and instead of being equalized downward, it's been spread out diffusely. What you see is a kind of intra-class competition that often is confused for inter-class competition. Again, I think that drives a lot of this PMC shit. But, and we can say proles unite all we want to, but we have to make it materially viable for them to do so. Well, here's the thing. Marx never could figure that out. I'll read this. Isn't it a double-edged sword, though? If you make people more comfortable, they are less likely to need for change. Isn't that what labor aristocracy tries to get at? It is, but there's also a real sense in that immiseration makes people desperate. And this is why Marx opposed accelerationist theories when they existed, for example, in the French communists, when the French communists were like, we need to have these reforms, but actually, but push acceleration in the capital. And Marx is like, no, if you have reforms, you're creating space. You're creating space for the working class to take power. But then Marx in the 1850s was an out-and-out immiserationist. And when you try to, it's one of these two theories that you see in Marxism that don't ever get really reconciled. Monopoly capital is another one. Monopoly capital versus the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Now, in value form or value terms, it's impossible to prove an abstract of the tendency to rate of profit to fall. But if you look at GDP as an indicator of something that might be profits or values, and it's a rough indicator, it is by no means perfect. GDP declines in almost every society over time, including China, as what they would call labor efficiency or technological innovation or what I call reducing socially necessary labor time increases. You can only extract so much. There's only so many new markets. The theory that bridged the two was imperialism, but as the entire world becomes capitalist, that's not that explanatory anymore, except for internal imperialism to itself, which generates all kinds of problems. Historically speaking, when the most likely to have times where there are revolutionary fervors, from what I've seen, and I've read both Marxist and non-Marxist material on this, is when you have a period where prosperity has been growing and then it dips away temporarily. That's what happened in the French Revolution. That's what happened with the American Revolution. That wasn't really what was happening with the Russian Revolution. And the other big prompter is war. Yeah, that is what Bernstein, more than Kautsky, tried to do. Bernstein thought that the industrial proletariat would never reach the amount of numbers to either militarily or diplomatically take over. And in Germany, he was actually correct at the time. But we have reached that point now. And that's the funny thing. Proletarian relations are 90% of the population. But the division of lifestyles available to different sectors of the proletariat are massive. All right. And I think that is like the rational core to the PMC theory, but that's not a separate class, right? And it's not a coherently productive class, even if it's a cultural class for itself, which I'm not sure it is, because managers and professionals and different kinds of professionals do not act in concert with each other. That very much seems like something you could believe if you're in New York, and not something you could believe if you actually were in the hinterland that they fetishize. So when I talk about this individual stuff, you also have to remember that I'm going to keep shooting. Actually, New York is my favorite of what I like to call the bourgeois megatropolises. My least favorite is probably the modern Bay Area. Although 10 years ago I liked the Bay Area. And I also have a very distinct anti-English, anti-London bias. I'm sure London's a wonderful city, but I think I've been genetically bred to hate it. I used to say that after the revolution, I would give New York the. Who's telling me to screw off right now? Oh, New York, yeah, I know. Or California. Who made me? You, that's not coherent. That's an ad hoc conspiracy theory. I think there's some truth to it. Managers and PMC, whatever that means, act in concert. But by the way, you have managers as a separate class from PMC, which makes no fucking sense. But I think because we really know that professionals are the professional class and the managerial class are separate. And they're not really classes, they're strata. And they're weird strata because the upper end of management are bourgeois because they get paid in stocks. And the lower end of management identify with them even if they don't. Whereas professionals are all over the place. They have various relationships, even internal to a profession, to the wage relation and to petit bourgeois status. And they have relative difference of curtailing. And curtailing is not just, and professionalization is not limited to the white collar credential classes that people use PMC for. So unless you mean professional as having a specific fiduciary responsibility to a client, in which case it is a much, much smaller subclass of people, and basically lawyers and accountants and fiscal managers and maybe tech people, the PMC is too broad of a class category. It's in a way that makes it hard to talk about. People try to defend it because it describes something they culturally know. Like it's something that is incoherent, it doesn't make any sense, and yet we all kind of know what we're talking about. But we're also used to just call that liberal cultural bullshit or liberal elitism or whatever. You're in the Midwest now. Deal with it. It's easy to like a place when you're not in it. Oh, I don't hate London. I'm just messing with you. My issue with London, actually, in all seriousness, is its concentration of wealth in the hands of the few. And I think that's many Londoners' issue with London. It is the same patterns you see in New York, LA, and the Bay, but more so. There's also teeming with poor people in different ways. And so, like, parts of London I'm sure I'd love, and parts of London I'm sure I'd hate. So I liked the Bay Area 10 years ago too, which was when you lived there. I still kind of like Oakland. And when I say I hate these cities, I actually don't like. I say I hate New York. I actually like New Yorkers a lot. I mean, like in all seriousness, most of the Londoners I've met abroad have been wonderful. But culturally, I'm more similar to people from Scotland. Actually, when I meet someone from Edinburgh, we tend to get along really well. Even though when they're drunk, I have no idea what the fuck they're saying. And so when I talk about this regional hatred, what I hate is what these cities have come to do to the rest of the country. They're brain drains on the rest of the country. People like me want to go to New York. if you're a working class intellectual and you get educated, you want to get the fuck out of the area, and it deracinates it, right? It is, and that's why it's culturally resented. My anti-English bias is deep, and you didn't produce me. My heritage is Scottish, Welsh, and Irish, if on the Isles, and then Bulgarian, and Bulgarian and Dutch, I think, off the Isles. And so, that's where I come from, the hinterlands. I think about the hinterlands. I also think about, like, you go to New York and you go to Atlanta, or you go to New Orleans, and I'd rather be poor in New York because I'm not paying the environmental costs that I'm paying in Atlanta or New Orleans, even though some of the poor parts of New York look like they've been bombed out even now. I'm also very comfortable in rural areas. What I'm not particularly comfortable in is, and I'm comfortable. I live in a mid-sized city. White, and white. What about white? Does my mixed heritage make me who I am? Probably, because I didn't identify with the predominant culture of where I grew up. And even the Christian parts of my family were considered outliers. I mean, personally, I do get along with Jim Burgess. Politically, I don't know how we're friends, but personally, when Doug, Michael Brooks, Ben Burgess, and I, and Peter Coffin, and a bunch of left celebrities all met in Idaho, I got along with the people in Idaho, and I kind of got along with Ben. And I've been mocking Ben for a decade. I've been, kind of interpersonally mean to Ben. He's going to be on the show tomorrow, by the way. So, if you want to take it up with Ben, you can take it up then. But I personally get along with him. I think our politics are we often start off with similar assumptions and go in radically different areas. So, I also, I'm not gonna lie, outside of leftist circles, I don't tend to hang out with men. I am a guy who grew up in a very macho culture. Used to shoot rats. I feel bad for the rats now. They're pretty intelligent. Intelligent creator. I would do not insult Molotov like that. Anyway, and we used to go shooting like AK-47s out in the woods and stuff. I would never tell anyone. I don't tell people to vote. So, but and I used to go bow hunting. I don't know. I used to think it was fair. I don't know why I thought it was fair to the animals, because really, it's really not. But I come out of that world, and when I'm around a bunch of leftist men, sometimes they do things that I use this term advisedly, trigger me. Literally trigger me. I'm not using that in like, oh, they make me mad. It's okay. You can Pax Britannia, breast thump. I get it. when an American insults the English, it's just like when the English insult Americans. We're like, I'm always like, we learned it from you, and they're always like, you screwed up our empire. Yeah, so there's a very much fuck you, Dad element to the United States and Britain, and Dad having lost their job, and America being the smug kid who's really smug about how they took their dad's job. So yeah, I grew up with, I grew up around gun culture. I'm still, I don't carry a gun anymore. I'll tell you why, if you want me to. If you don't want me to, I won't. I think Ben's a good guy, personally. I don't always. I think I almost never agree with his politics, but I do think he's on the same spectrum as me, even if he's approaching a part of it that I'm kind of uncomfortable with. Both market socialism and sort of a willingness to underplay certain cultural threats, because for him they do seem safer than they are. Well, I mean, like, yeah, the Welshness. You would have got me if you got me with more like Cardiff pride there, Timmy, because I kind of have a softness for red dragons. Has Ben ever had a real job? I think so. He's never had, since the time I've known him, he's been in academia, but never on the top. He's never had a tenure track position. He's always been like scrambling. He's usually not. I mean, he's not usually materially super comfortable. Do you think we should have markets within socialism? No, I don't. But I think that markets will probably be in the transition period. I hope not. I think. Well, here's a question. Most labor token schemes do effectively have something like a market mechanism. How much of my day do I spend reading? A lot more lately because I work at home. But a lot of what I read is shit, guys. I read manuscripts and student essays. Like, yeah, it is capitalism. Like, would I like to go back on the Thaddeus Russell podcast? That was a weird podcast. That is a charming guy. He's a postmodern rightist, or conservative. I don't know, somewhere in there. He's libertarian-ish. Ben fell down a Korean mountain. Yes, so have I. So that's unimpressive. Ben and I both spent time in Korea, although we didn't know each other at the time. We became close later due to that time period. So what do I read a day? I probably spend about 2 hours a day reading student essays. I spend about an hour to an hour and a half a day reading Christopher Lash, and then I read on my own. And then I also have to read for podcasts. So I probably spend 3 to 4 hours a day reading. I also read very, very fast. And that is, I'm dyslexic and aphasic. And I came out of that from graduate school because I didn't realize that all my other more well-off students didn't actually read the book. So I just tried to push myself until I could read as fast as I could. And I talk really fast. And so what I do is, you see the speed I'm talking, I can talk much faster than I can talk like this. And that's the speed I read at in my head. And that's how I read very fast. Ever learned? Yeah, I have learned things from student essays. My students are incredibly honest with me. And I'll leave it at that. And one of my former students from a long time ago, is probably 30 now, was in the audience earlier. And I was talking crap about our hometown. So I think this thing with theory, why do I take theory seriously? Because I think we have to be coherent in the way we approach the world, but that's not how we get here. All right. When I talk about argumentation and reaching out and putting yourself in another person's frame of mind, it's because how I became a leftist. It really was learning to think both analytically and with empathy at the same time to people who were radically different with me. And the people, and it wasn't like, I grew up around working class Black people, to the point that when I was a young kid, I didn't really think of them as different from me. It came later. So that one was easy. The next step was being more empathetic to women in my life. And I do judge leftists by how they treat women, particularly women they're not sleeping with, in my life. If you treat women poorly, my my thinking on economic planning. What about my thinking on economic planning? I've done a lot of thinking about it, and the more thinking about it I do, the more confused I get. I do think that labor tokens have a tendency to replicate some of the problems of markets. But I don't know if they replicate all the ones that are crucial. And different labor token schemes actually act differently about how limited they are in transference, and this, that, and the other. So I also tend to think that teleological centralized planning is overly fragile. And I am one of the few leftist thinkers who thinks that it in the systems theory frame of mind, you're trading off efficiency for brittleness. So where and ribosomic models of planning are inefficient but highly resilient. And it's kind of the problem with centralized planning versus capitalist planning. Although, ironically, most capitalist planning over time becomes more and more centralized. It starts centralized, usually with the state instantiating something like a market, and ends centralized. So a lot of leftists consider centralization to be good, bro. Yeah, I think a lot about that stuff, like trains that went to nowhere and incentivizing lying, which also the USSR did, which is why I'm not a state capitalist theorist. I am a non-mode of production theorist, and people confuse me and Doug Lane on this point. Doug Lane holds on to Dunyaskaya's and C.L.R. Jane's version of state capitalism, based on value production. I point out that there were different values operating in the USSR at different levels of production and how it related to the global market. So it did act like a capitalist on the national scale sometimes, but it didn't internally, and definitely didn't, like, markets were not true markets on the bottom of the scale, even if currency and markets were not entirely abolished, which means the system didn't fucking function. So it has too many elements of capitalism, but it has non-capitalist elements and kind of blows up. So yeah, I do need to think more about it. I've just thought a lot about it, and the more I think about it, the more confused I get. For example, I actually believe the knowledge problem is a problem. It's just not unique to state planning at all. It is a universal problem. And markets don't get you out of it because markets don't have perfect information symmetry. It's like all market equilibriums assume information symmetry, and that doesn't exist in the real world anywhere. Furthermore, in regards to information symmetry, they assume that 99%, that the closer you get to information symmetry, even if it's imperfect, it's just that much better. And there's study after study after study, even by capitalists, particularly in Canada. You can read this guy Joseph Heath talks about that proves that, like, that's not actually true. That approaching information symmetry actually makes some perverse incentives worse than having it altogether. Meaning that like what capitalists say about socialism is actually true about capitalism. Actual capitalism never actually, real experience capitalism is never what you say it is. There is never a equilibrium market with information symmetry. Therefore, your answer to these problems is bullshit. But I do think the knowledge problem that, like, there's going to be things you can't plan for and account for in planning, that's universally with us. It's just not capitalist firms have the problem too. It destroys them too, which is why I do worry about overly centralizing planning, even though I believe in planning. Overly centralized planning would be brittle. All right, there's a lot of interesting comments right now. Whoa, we got way off. I was gonna tell people though that I think I came on telling people you need to have a certain amount of compassion for people who are attracted to or from the culture or from conservative cultures. You don't need to try to replicate or appeal to them on ideological lines or try to win Trumpist or whatever dumb. Like someone who's an ideologue is always lost. Like even a left ideologue. I don't try to convince left ideologues. They're fucking useless to me. So I separate those approaches, but I also know that like I'm not going to ask anyone to deal with the kind of person who wants to kill them. I tend to think that's rare, but when leftists make appeals to like conservative people, they tend to make the appeals not to like average everyday Joes, but to ideological positions, and that's nutty. But you know, I also know I still have good relationships with conservative people or people from conservative cultures IRL because I don't live in a leftist silo. Favorite assumption of neoclassical economics: circular rationality. That everything is rational because you do it. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, when I see people trying to make appeals to conservatives, they tend to mimic the worst elements of conservative thought and the most dishonest elements of conservative thought. It's just you don't make ideological appeals to people. I mean, even if you're trying to win someone over to their ideology, like there's a certain kind of left demagoguery that like appeals to populists, right? That you would think would be popular with working class people, but it tends to not be. It tends to impress working class people's educated children who are projecting upon their parents, like it used to impress me. What's the difference between ideology and morality? Effectively, nothing. I would actually say that in my practice, morality is virtue driven, and that means you mimic traits that you want to see successful in yourself. And it is also other centric, so it's about your relationship to others. But most people use ideology and morality as a affective gloss, which means that it is about ideas of personal identity and emotion. I think for example, I think you see a return to durable consumer goods versus indurable consumer goods if you're not generated on profit motive. So there would be some consumer goods on the socialism and some would be unnecessary, but a lot of the capricious consumption would not be there, I don't think. Well, I also think about like national union organizations in Italy being a fiasco that actually hurt workers because the national have very little interest to see sectional workers' interests taken care of. Yeah, so yeah, you'd see a shift to durable consumer goods. So they're durable goods, but they might be for pleasure, but they won't be wasteful. Like, why have 50? Like, I would rather have personally when I lived abroad and lived in more, frankly, archaic economies. You know, I would buy fewer clothes, but I'd have them tailored because I could afford to do so. I would rather spend $50 on a sewn shirt than $20 on a shitty one, even though here it's probably $50 anyway. And most people in the area, if they could, they would. And in America, you just never see that. Europe confuses me more on this. And when I was in Europe, you still had some of that old durable goods culture still existing in Germany when I was there. I was in Germany in the year 2000, guys. It was 20 years ago. I can't really generalize anything now. All right. Well, I'm gonna go hang out with my partner. I hope you guys got something out of this. And my Welsh friend, card of solidarity forever. I'll forgive you for getting defensive about me slagging on London. What about nationalizing, socializing very small businesses? I'm really torn on this. I've really gone back and forth about. Most farms would be socialized now because most farms are agribusiness for effectively. Very small farms are rare. What would we do with very small farms? I would probably formally say that they don't own the land, but give them perpetual rights to it so that they don't become a reactionary problem. That's what I would do. Like, so they would own the land in fact, sort of. They'd have absolute use value over it, but like, you're not taken away from anybody. We probably don't need it. And all the agribusiness stuff would be nationalized. Or actually socialized, probably even better than nationalized. I distrust nationalizations. Small businesses, I don't know. I mean, the petit bourgeois problem is a serious problem. My favorite theorists are central theorists for the left. I mean, other than Marx, I always tell people read more history than theory. But if I was gonna read theory, I think Raymond Williams, E.P. Thompson, which is not really theory, it's more history. Bukharin, Panacuk, I guess, is kind of theoretical, and Paul Matic is also kind of theoretical. But they're, and I would also tell people to read Nietzsche and a lot of stuff that isn't left wing, and to really try to understand it. I mean, the problem with small businesses is we're talking about abolishing markets altogether, right? My favorite Target team is Arsenal. Actually, my favorite soccer team is Santos in northern Mexico, in the city that I used to live in, northern Mexico. That's my favorite soccer club because I fucking lived there, and you should be loyal to the soccer club in which you have lived. My favorite European one is Arsenal. And I usually vote for Mexico in the World Cup. I couldn't take the land off them. Land ownership, although concentrating now, remains widely dispersed in Ireland. Well, I would say in Ireland, let it be wildly dispersed. But I would say that it would be, formally speaking, I would say that they wouldn't own the land, because if you establish that president, you've established a social president that's bad. But I would let them have right of working it and all right of proceeds from what they work. Who wins a ring this year? I don't know. I don't keep up with it enough. I only really watch the World Cup. I liked Arsenal because my best friend in Korea liked Arsenal. Okay, Kelsey Ham, you can ask one question since I'm about to go. Ask it. Okay, I'll start watching Swansea and see how I feel. Santos is my team though, and that's in Torreon, in Mexico. What are some good history bio books that provide the context for the big name theorist? I would read Marxism in a Lost Century for the context of Paul Matic. I would read Enzo Traverso's Left Melancholia for a lot of the European context. I would read a couple of books on May 68. I would read for America. I would read anything written by a Black Panther. Christopher Lash's first 4 books. That's Liberals in the Russian Revolution, New American Radicals, The Agony of the American Left, and World of Nations. I would read any good sizable history of the SPA to understand the U.S. context. I'd read a history, anything you can find that's not hagiographic on the various Trotskyist organizations. I would read anything you can read about labor history, and then I would read any good tell-all thing about theory in France, and then the dialectical imagination for the history of the Frankfurt School. That, just so you asked, and also, yeah, Hobsbawm, read Hobsbawm. Forging Democracy is a good source with some biases. What I tell people is just you got to read widely if you read. But I don't think everyone has to do. Everyone doesn't have to be a left-wing intellectual on their own, man. It's like we have a division of labor. We live in a capitalist society. Just find people you trust and who are honest with you. Have them help you read, and also trust them. But try to verify shit on your own in the best you can. But if you can't read 1,000 books, don't feel bad about it. I'm not trying to make you all little commie people who have effectively done their own PhD program like I did. It's a weird habit. Okay, so I took Alan. All right, Kelsey Ham. Buy new ones. All right, man. That's such a reference from 20 years ago. I don't like that book. I actually do like Gerald Horne's other works on settler colonialism. I think Counter-Revolution of 1776 is kind of weird. It does British apologia in ways that kind of pretend like they weren't being cynical about what they were doing in regards to the colonists. Ah, the trolls have shown up. Where are the Billy Goats Gruff when you need them? All right, it's time to end this before we're under the bridge, motherfucker.